Okay, amazing. So today we're going to be discussing safeguarding through an anti-racist lens. So it's going to be adding to a lot of what you already know on safeguarding, but really focusing on anti-racism and how we can use safeguarding to protect the young people within our institutions that are of the global majority or are BAME or of colour. So we'll discuss a few different terminologies and which terminology we use and why. Hi, Mina. Would you be able to put in the chat what school you're from and whether you are primary or secondary, just so we know how to tailor this to the people that are on the call with us? Okay. So this is what we're going to be covering today. A little bit of introduction, then we're going to be discussing racism concerns and safeguarding, exploring a few barriers and stereotypes, and then we're going to have an activity at the end where we're sort of, you'll have a worksheet and you'll be strategizing some of what you've learned in this session into what changes you could bring in your school. So you will see in the chat a link to a handout. So that is the worksheet that we'll be working on today. So if you haven't already downloaded it, it would be good to download it now. We're going to be doing 2 activities, one in the middle of the session and one at the end of the session. Okay, so just a few house rules. It'd be great if everyone could just keep their microphones on mute, but if you do want to say something, please just take yourself off mute and jump in. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Feel free to use the chat function, ask any questions that you want or just any comments. We'll be doing an activity, so if you haven't already downloaded the worksheet, do that now. And lastly, there's going to be interactive activities which we call Slidos. So a Slido, it will be a link that's being put in the chat. You click the link and you just write down your answer and it will auto-populate on the screen. Or you can, there'll be a QR code that you can scan with your phone. So being interactive as possible is amazing. Okay. So what do we mean by racism? This might seem like a question, but we all have probably a million different answers of what racism means to us and what racism means in our school context. So I'm going to give about 30 seconds on the clock, and I would like everyone to write something in the chat of what does racism mean? What's the definition of it? What does it mean in your school context? So I'll give you all just a few moments to write anything in the chat. Okay, so if you just joined, we're writing down what does racism mean in the chat. So what is your definition of what racism is, and how does racism show up in a school context? If everyone could write down in the chat for me their answer to this question, that would be great. Amazing. Thank you, Hallie. In a school context, students being treated differently and discriminated against due to their race, their heritage, or cultural background. Yes, this is really important that when we talk about racism, we're not just talking about race, we're talking about culture, we're talking about also religion can be discriminated in racism, we're talking about heritage. There's lots of different things that can be encompassed by the term racism. Anyone else? I'll give you 20 more seconds for anyone else to write anything in the chat. Okay, I'll give 10 more seconds. If anyone else has any other comments to put in the chat, I would be happy to hear them. Okay, we're going to move on. Oh, I've just had one more. Yeah, a deliberate affront based on the criteria Hallie mentioned. Yeah, amazing. Just sort of still agreeing with the same, being treated differently and discriminated against due to race, heritage, and cultural background. So this is what we mean by racism. So when we talk about racial justice in school environments, we have to understand the different types of racism and racial bias that might be existing within school environments. So firstly, we have personalized racism. This can also be known as interpersonal racism. So this is racism that occurs between individuals. And this is what most of us think. We think of someone being discriminated against, someone using bad language, someone making jokes, a group of people discriminating against another group of people, like when we see in football and people harassing global majority players. That would all count as interpersonal racism. One person against another person, or a group of people against another group of people. And then we also have systemic and institutionalized racism. So this is racism that exists within and between institutions and organizations across a society. So when we talk about institutionalized racism, so a school is an institution. So when we think about subtle forms of discrimination, or simply if the system has been set up to normalize a certain identity, so to normalize heterosexual, white, neurotypical individuals, that would be institutional bias. So having a system set up to favor one group of characteristics. This is what we mean by systemic and institutionalized racism. It's not necessarily been chosen to be that way by any one individual. It could be something that's happened over time, and it's happened to where it is today. So when we're about systemic and institutionalized, it can be much more subtle, and that requires unpicking systems and making sure that the systems that we're in are working for all children within that institution. So we have to be open-minded to the way that these two types of racism both exist and might intertwine within our school environments to effectively safeguard children of colour. So it's not just safeguarding them against name calling or discrimination or interpersonal racism, it's safeguarding them from the institutions itself and any bias that might be occurring in there. So terminology. So you might have heard me say a few times the word global majority. So this basically means anyone that identifies as non-white. So the majority of people in the world are Black, brown, and non-white races. So global majority means world majority, which is more factually accurate. And we use this instead of the term ethnic minority, because when we use the term minority, especially when we're talking to young people or we're talking about children, it makes us feel small and less valued and less important, like a small part of a big thing. So even though Black, brown, and non-white communities are a minority in the UK, within the world and within the globe, we're actually the majority. However, some people might find that problematic because you're still using the term majority, which some people might find divisive. So other words you can use is student of colour, person of colour, racialized minority. So all of these things basically mean the same thing, but I'm going to use the term global majority. So what is safeguarding in a school context? So we've used the definition from Keeping Children Safe in Education, and this defines safeguarding as protecting children from maltreatment, preventing impairment of children's mental and physical health or development, ensuring that children grow up in circumstances that are consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and taking action to enable all children to have the best outcomes. So this isn't just enabling children to have the best outcomes from children that have like the majority of non-protected characteristics. This is enabling that every single child, regardless of their characteristics and their barriers, will have the best outcomes. So hopefully by the end of this training, everyone will have a clear understanding of the effects of racism on a young person's well-being, because there's no way that we can understand how to safeguard a young person from racism if we don't understand the effects of racism on a young person. So if we don't understand the depths of the effects of it, then we can't understand how to prevent it and how to ensure that there's care. And then number two, to protect young global majority people in your care, racism must be thought of as a safeguarding issue, not a bullying issue, and must be treated with the severity that it deserves. So I know a lot of schools now, and a lot of the schools that we are working with have started already addressing racism as a safeguarding issue. It's not coming under the Anti-Bullying Act, it's coming under the safeguarding protection. And that's where we believe it should sit. Okay, so has anyone heard of the author Orleen Badu? She's written a book called How to Build Your Anti-Racist Classroom. It's an amazing read. You can get it on Amazon. I would definitely recommend it to any educator. It's a very easy read. It's very affordable. Definitely have a look into getting yourself a copy. However, in the book, Orleen, at the beginning of the book, she explains the difference between a non-racist educator versus an anti-racist educator. And what she explains is that the opposite of racist isn't to not be racist, isn't to simply just not be racist. It's to be anti-racist. The opposite of being racist is anti-racist, taking the active role in combating injustice and racism. So on the left-hand column here, we have a non-racist educator. And a lot of us, unless someone has specifically highlighted this to us, or we've had specific training on anti-racism, a lot of us will sit in the left-hand column because we haven't been told differently. And it hasn't been highlighted for us. So this isn't an attack. It's just for your own awareness. So a non-racist educator might be uncomfortable and might be afraid of uncomfortable conversations. So if you've never been taught how to discuss some sensitive topics, then it can be easier just to simply not have those conversations. A non-racist educator watches things happen as a spectator. This is more like when we talk about watching things happen as a spectator, this can mean, for example, seeing a charity advert on television. You can still have that emotional reaction and be like, that is awful. I can't believe these things are happening to those people. It's so terrible. And you can have that emotional empathy and that emotional reaction. However, if it doesn't drive you to take action, it's still a spectator rather than an active role. They may be unaware or in denial of their own biases. We all like to think we're not racist, right? But in order for us to, take this journey positively, we have to start recognizing where we all do have our own biases. Where do we make assumptions about people? Where do those assumptions come about? And it's okay to have those biases and to be on a journey of recognizing them. Afraid of teaching social justice and doesn't challenge school systemic inequality. So a person might have recognized it, but they might not know how to challenge it. Whereas an anti-racist educator embraces uncomfortable conversations, perhaps letting students lead those conversations where your students have more lived experience in certain areas. It's okay for you as an educator not to know everything about everything and allowing your students to take the lead when they can. Speaks up and disrupts, takes an active role rather than that spectator role, aware of and in the journey of challenging their own biases, fights for justice in the taught and untaught curriculum, actively seeks to dismantle bias systems in the school, and ultimately is part of the solution. Okay, we're going to move on. So we want to keep that in mind, where we want to be gradually moving over from the left-hand column to the right-hand column. And these training sessions and these little bits of knowledge are going to equip you with the skills that you can move over into that column. Okay. So we talked about understanding the effects of racism on young people. So in order for us to understand the effects of racism, we have to understand what is called racial trauma. So firstly, we have what is called historical trauma. Historical trauma is a form of trauma that impacts entire communities. So it refers to cumulative emotional and psychological damage as a result of a group traumatic experience. And this can also be passed down from generation to generation. So if our global majority students, they might be second or third generation immigrants, or even fourth generation immigrants, yet they might still be carrying the trauma from their grandparents or their parents that first coming over to this country. And that sort of trauma is often passed down through generation, through stories, through, what parents do to try and keep their kids safe. They might, warn their children about racism, or warn them about having to work harder because of the color of their skin, etc. And it can also link to certain things on the curriculum. So where my family are from in Bengal, we don't view Winston Churchill as a hero because of his connections to colonization and to the Bengal famine happening. So where my family are from in Bengal, Winston Churchill isn't viewed as a hero. However, in the UK, he is. So it's just being aware that different things that might seem normal for it to be on the British curriculum might affect and might trigger a trauma response in different communities of people. So this is known as generational trauma or historical trauma. And then secondly, we have racial trauma. So traumatic events that occur as a result of witnessing or experiencing racism, discrimination, or structural prejudice. So when the murder of George Floyd happened, this triggered racial trauma all over the world. So it was so widely publicized and so widely spoken about that it caused so much racial trauma all over the world that people use this trauma to go out into the streets and march for Black Lives Matter. So millions of people from 60 countries, I think in the end, all marched the streets for the rights of Black communities. So when we talk about racial trauma, it doesn't have to be racism that your young people have personally experienced. It could be something that they've witnessed, and that also creates a trauma response in young people. So it could be something that they've witnessed in school, something that's happened to their parents, something that's happened on the news that, it could be miles and miles away from them. But we need to understand that this could be creating trauma. It's also a thing to note that not all of your global majority students will have trauma. However, it's important to realize that these things could be at play, and that could be making your young people more vulnerable to certain things at different times. And it's very difficult to spot racial trauma or historical trauma. It's very difficult to spot it and diagnose it. So the more that we have our awareness of over what barriers might be affecting different communities of students, the better. So sources of racial trauma. So we've consulted a few different studies and research papers, and we've collected some stats here, some stats around what could be the sources of racial trauma in schools. So 95% of Black pupils hearing racist language at school. This is from a 2020 study. Global majority students are twice as likely to have their name mispronounced or shortened at school. This is also linked to the increased frequency of being mistaken for other Black or brown students at the school. So we hear about this all the time. I guess some people, maybe their name is difficult to pronounce, but if they're consistently getting their name mispronounced or shortened, or someone from a particular community is always being mistaken for another child that looks like them, this compounds racial trauma. 30% of Black students having experienced hair discrimination versus 0% of white students surveyed. So this could be hair discrimination in form of like making fun of natural Black hair, It could also be uniform policies being discriminatory towards Black pupils or Black cultural hairstyles. So all of these things can result in, indirect discrimination as well. 1 in 5 students of color experienced racism from a teacher or a staff member in the form of jokes or cultural insensitivity. This was from a 2022 study. And lastly, 75% of students who experienced racism didn't report it, and only 7% of students felt like they had received justice from their school institutions. So one thing that we do highlight is when we're talking about incident processing and safeguarding, the school might have the best process in the world. However, if it's not fed back what happened to the victim of the incident, then they will feel like they didn't receive justice, or they will feel like nothing was done. And then it will prevent them from seeking help in the future. So having that feedback loop is so important when it comes to incident reporting, incident processes, especially around racist incidences. So racism must be treated as a safeguarding issue in schools because it directly impacts the safety and well-being of mental health and development of our students. So it has a huge mental health impact. Racism can lead to feelings of isolation, low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, also emotional and physical safety. Students might fear for their physical safety. They might fear for their emotional safety as well. Bullying and harassment, this is talking about more severe aspects of racism, more overt aspects of racism, bullying, physical harassment, violence, and long-term health effects. So in a study, they found that the persistent effects of small microaggressions had the largest impact of long-term health effects. So a young person going to school fearing that they might experience a microaggression at any moment, whether it's their name being shortened, whether someone's stereotyped them, whether they've got their bag checked, all these different like small incidences, that cumulative effect of fearing that might happen at any moment resulted in the worst longer term health effects. So we're also going to talk about academic consequences. So when we talk about safeguarding, we're not just talking about mental health and well-being, but we're also talking about how it's going to affect the rest of their lives. So if racism and incidences are affecting their academic work, that could have huge effects on the rest of their life. So we're going to watch this short video that beautifully explains about learning brain versus survival brain and how it's highly relevant to young people experiencing microaggressions or daily stereotyping. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. Please let me know if you can't hear it once I start playing it.
Hey, welcome back. I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be just to make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. It's about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. It's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again? Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier.
Okay, so we're going to do a quick mood check. Can everyone write in the chat one thing that they might have learned, one thing new that they've learned so far, or that they've learned from that video? I'll give everyone about 30 to 40 seconds to write something in the chat. So one thing that you've learned, one new thing that you've learned today, or one new thing that you've learned from that video about learning brain versus survival brain. Amazing, thank you, JD. That you live more in survival mode. Yeah, it's really important when these things are highlighted to us. There's so many instances that we think, oh, maybe that was us. Maybe that was us operating in survival mode. And when I first saw this video, I saw how that was operating in some of the young people that we were teaching. Some young people that would sit at the back and they would just have their head down and be just not wanting to be picked on, not wanting to be spoken to, not wanting to be looked at, almost like wishing they were invisible in a way. And that could be survival brain operating there. And we don't really know what's going on. Thank you, Vandana. Reinforces again how emotion-driven learning is. Yeah, 100%. When we're feeling relaxed and safe, we don't mind putting our hand up and getting something wrong because we're just in a learning environment. But when we feel really self-conscious, or when our students feel really self-conscious, they're just wishing for it to be over, which again prevents them from achieving academically. Yeah, thank you, Naomi. More aware of the science survival brain. Absolutely. Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts with me. Okay. And now these are just some things that can cause triggering of learning brain versus survival brain. So learning brain, we have feeling valued and feeling safe. What I've just mentioned is, when you're in a classroom and you feel safe and everyone there is your friend and you're happy, you don't mind putting yourself out there and getting something wrong. So feeling safe amongst the adults present, you have that confidence that they will protect you in that setting. Feeling represented. So that could be represented by the curriculum, by the books you're studying, by the videos you watch, by the posters on the walls, represented by the staff that are teaching you. Feeling heard, that sense of building trust over time, and strong teacher-student relationships. And some things that can trigger survival brain, being stereotyped or feeling stereotyped. Feeling unrepresented or negatively represented by the curriculum, national holidays, or culture days. So we had one example from a student. We were focus grouping with some young people in our office a couple of months ago. And one group of young boys were talking about how Black History Month, should be this really fun thing where they get to celebrate their culture and their school. However, that particular year, they felt that it was just one big stereotype. There was just overrepresented of Black people standing outside of mud huts and tribal, culture and things like that. And it's not to say that there aren't Black communities that live in those settings, but they just felt it just wasn't a true representation of like what Black culture, especially in Britain, was. And they just felt hugely triggered, hugely unrepresented. And that was meant to be a month that was meant to be fun for them to celebrate. Racist microaggressions, biased hair and uniform policies. So we spoke briefly about 30% of Black students receiving hair discrimination versus 0% of white students. Past trauma leading to lack of trust in authority figures, lack of positive role models. So that could be role models within the school or within, what you're studying. Adultification, we'll go deeper into adultification shortly. And public discipline and humiliation. So in Orline Badou's book, also, she did a lot of research before she wrote the book, and she did a lot of focus grouping, a lot of talking to young, particularly Black communities from across the country. And what she found is that young Black boys in particular were more on the receiving end of public discipline. So publicly being shouted at, publicly being disciplined in front of their peers or in front of other staff. And this is what we mean by that public humiliation. So the longer a student ill brain, the longer it takes for them to come out of it. Students learn best when they feel safe and supported by the adults around them. They can't learn if the flight, fight, or freeze response is always being triggered. Okay, my colleague Naz is going to put in the chat for this the link for the first Slido activity. The question is, are global majority pupils more vulnerable to abuse and neglect? If yes, why? And if no, why? So you can either click the link or you can scan the QR code with your phone. Okay. This is why I like Slidos, because it auto-populates. As it would be amazing if everyone could write something that their thoughts. So we have perhaps yes as global majority peoples perhaps face more barriers. Yes, because of racial stereotypes, and yes, potentially because they're mismanaged by institutions. I think this last one is really, really important. It's not particularly anything that the young people are doing, it's the institutions that they're in and how young people are managed, or how the protection of young global majority people is mismanaged. So I think that one's really interesting. Also, yes, because of racial stereotypes. Yeah, so we have potentially because it's minimized, there's stereotypes, we have lots of yeses, we have empathy. Amazing. Thank you, everyone. There's one more participant typing, so I'll see what they have to say, and then we can move on. And one other thing is the term marginalized. So when we use the term marginalized, we mean individuals with characteristics that result in them being pushed to the margins of society. And the more marginalized a person is, the more vulnerable they are in general, the less protected by the institution they are, because they are being pushed to the margins of society. Okay, just got a massive yes. Amazing. Okay, thank you, everyone. Cool. So I took this from a training that we did with the NSPCC, and they spoke a little bit about, are global majority children more vulnerable to abuse and neglect, and why? So children belonging to global majority backgrounds might encounter extra obstacles when discussing abuse compared to their peers. So this could be obstacles perhaps because being marginalized. They could face extra obstacles because they lack trust in authority. So certain children from global majority communities might have encountered adverse interactions with white individuals in positions of power, or individuals in positions of power, like educators or law enforcement officers. So as a result, they might be reluctant to reveal or report instances of abuse to authority figures. So the less trust in authority and the less trust in the system that a young person and their community might have, the less likely you are to go to those authority figures to seek help. And then this will prevent a young person knowing where to ask for help or where to flag. Global majority children and their families in the UK might be facing communication or language barriers. So if the student is EAL, or their parents or their community is EAL, it might be the extra communication barrier. That might be a barrier for them asking for help. Young people might experience racism in the form of bullying, directly or indirectly, and this could result in them this sort of abuse and neglect. It could be racism that they're facing, whether that's overt racism or microaggressions. If schools don't properly assess or act on these issues of racism, it can further alienate those students and their communities. So if a student feels safe within their school, and if incidences of racism are tackled effectively, you're creating that safe environment for young people to ask for help. Okay, so ways teachers and all school staff can combat racial trauma and create safe environments. So number one is to improve your understanding of how race and ethnicity result in increased safeguarding vulnerabilities. So understanding the different cultures that are at your school, and what are the nuances of those different cultures. And also I had a conversation with a teacher recently about how different groups of their community will interact with the curriculum in different ways. And the more you understand your parent body and your student body, the more equipped you're going to be to effectively safeguard your community. So to improve understanding of trauma, which is what we're doing today, and how it can affect the young people that we teach. To understand the increased need for global majority students to have avenues of discussion. So having safe spaces within the school where they can discuss things, that the barriers that they face. This could be simply as having access to a trusted staff member where they can talk about if they feel like they're experiencing racism, if they're experiencing stereotyping, what does that look like? Do they have a safe person they can go to and talk to? Understanding that resilience and resistance to racism and systemic oppression can be increased by creating an environment that acknowledges the role of systemic racism. So I think the worst thing we can do when we're supporting our global majority students is to create a space where we're pretending that systemic bias and systemic equalities don't exist. Where it's like, oh, you know, within this school, we're equal and we're just gonna, you know, go with that. But we're not acknowledging the wider world and how systemic inequalities affect everyone. There are, you know, not just talk about race and ethnicity, but there are so many protected characteristics. And the more of those characteristics you have, the more marginalized you're going to be as an individual. When we create spaces where we're having conversations about systemic oppression and inequality and activism and community action, you're building the resilience for yourself and for your young people. And lastly, understanding the need to embrace uncomfortable conversations, understand that our own uncomfortability should not be more important than creating a space for our students to discuss the things that might be troubling them and causing them mental distress. Okay, we're going to be talking a little bit about bias and stereotypes. So all of us hold certain understandings of the world based on our previous knowledge, based on our experiences, where we went to school, where we went to university, if we went to university, you know, where we went to, how we spent our weekends, what friends we had. All of these personal experiences result in how we view the world through our lens. And this can also might unintentionally feed into biases about certain people or communities. So this is called unconscious bias. So unconscious bias can lead us to interpret the same behavior differently depending on the characteristics of the person displaying it. So as a result, children might end up being misunderstood and not receive the safeguarding support that they need. So like depending on their identities, two people expressing the exact same behavior, one person could be seen as a cry for help and the other person could be seen as a threat. And that could result in them being detained or something like that. So I'm going to read this quote out for you. So we have the power as educators, we have the power to disrupt cycles of inequality, but we also have the power to continue these cycles of inequality. So as educators and as school staff members, you have a huge amount of power to influence the young people within that institution. So you have the power to really disrupt and you know, being that role model that is disrupting oppression could have an amazing effect on a young person going forward. So types of bias. We have affinity bias. So feeling a connection to those that are similar to us. So yeah, if you meet someone and you have a certain similarity with them, maybe they grew up in the same town you did, or maybe you went to the same school, we went to the same primary school, and maybe you know the same person through LinkedIn. That little connection will result in that feeling safer with that person, feeling a connection with that person. Perception bias, stereotypes and assumptions about different groups. So these are assumptions about a group, not based in reality, not based on our experiences of that group. And we can get our assumptions through media, through film, through what your parents said growing up, anywhere. This is called perception bias. A halo effect. projecting positive qualities onto people without actually knowing them. This can often happen in like recruitment. So you could look at someone's CV and be like, oh my God, this person's amazing. They went to this school, they did this, they're amazing. And then when you meet the person, they might, not be that great, but you're projecting the positive characteristics onto them because you really love their CV, for example. And confirmation bias, looking to confirm our own opinions and pre-ideas. So this can be good or bad. So we could have unconscious bias that this certain group is more dangerous than this certain group. And so your brain will look for examples to prove that you're right. Your brain wants to be right. And so it wants to confirm what your pre-existing idea is. And the same if you're like this, you've just hired a new person, you really like them, and so your brain looks for all the amazing things that they do to be like, oh, I know I was right, I knew I should have hired this person, look how amazing they are. So it can go either way. Okay, so we're now going to talk about a few phenomenons, and then we're going to do an activity. So I don't want you to get bored by the sound of my voice. We're going to talk about 4 different phenomenons or themes that could come up. And some of them you might have heard before and some of them you might not have. And then we're going to do an activity about what we've learned. So adultification. Most of you would have heard this term, adultification. It was really heavily spoken about around the Child Q incident, and how that young female was hugely let down by both the school and the justice system, and that young person was adultified. She was being treated as older than she was. So adultification is a form of bias where children from Black, Asian and minoritized ethnic communities are perceived as being more streetwise or more grown up, less innocent and less vulnerable than other children. This particularly affects Black children who might be viewed primarily as a threat rather than a child who needs support. So this is supported by a few different studies. And there was a study recently that I read that young Black boys are, I think, between the ages of 12 and 17 are viewed as 4 to 5 years older than their white peers. And someone asked me why. I don't know, to be honest. But this adultification means that, this is a quote from the former Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, this means that we look after them slightly less and they don't get the protections and the safeguarding that they should. So children that are seen as older and then their behaviour is treated as older, they're protected less, they're protected slightly less, and they're looked after less. Then we have the Black escalation effect. So this was a study, a 2021 study. They researched into discipline between Black and white students. They only focus on those 2 races, Black, white. They found that Black students were more likely to receive escalated discipline, and this was put down to implicit bias held by teachers. When a pattern of behaviour was detected that corresponds with existing stereotypes, the response was that the discipline was more severely escalated, so happened quicker, it got worse quicker. The study found that Black students, regardless of their reputation, were treated the same way as white students with a bad reputation. This was compared to the discipline received by white students with a good or neutral reputation. So just to re-emphasize that point, that all the Black students that were surveyed and studied in this study were treated the same as a white student with a bad reputation. So whether they're always absent or they're known for being a bit naughty or a bit troublesome in class, that was how the discipline was perceived. And I also want to share this case study with you from young people that we have worked with. And they've provided these quotes for us just so you can see how these phenomenons happen or in a school context. So this is a Black male secondary school student, but this also applies to primary school as well. So all of these effects can be seen across both primary and secondary, just slightly different context. So he says, I think it's harder for white teachers to bond with students who aren't white as they don't share similar experiences. Students feel more comfortable talking to a black teacher or a teacher of color. This is especially important when students have been in trouble. Black students feel like incidences are escalated to their worst scale, and we would prefer to talk to a teacher of color to understand both sides of the story. Whereas a white student might get a slap on the wrist, talk to a person from the global majority. So this secondary school student was speaking about his experiences and what he's observed within his school and his perceptions of how discipline happens. And he thinks that when he and other black male students in particularly get in trouble, he felt like the discipline was escalated rapidly, very rapidly, and when they tried to talk back, it was just escalated even further. And they felt like they needed a person of their own ethnicity or of the global majority to really sit with them and understand what happened. So not understand, the stereotypes of what happened, what actually happened. We also have a case study from a black female secondary school student. She says there's a lot of unnecessary harassment of students because of skin color. At our school, everyone is subject to random bag checks, but this is always escalated when it comes to non-white students, and we feel like we are targeted more. So that turn of phrase, unnecessary harassment, those were her words. I'm just going to read this out that came in the chat because I think this is really interesting. So adultification, the removal of childhood dehumanization due to imperial, colonial, historical trauma has led to black, brown students forced into confirmation bias scenarios. So this, in sort of layman's terms, the confirmation bias scenario is people seeing stereotypes on the news, on film, wherever. And when a young person is, I guess, is in a scenario where they might get in trouble, the person will link that person's behavior to something that they've seen on the news. And that will be their confirmation bias that this group is dangerous, I'm under threat, I need to quickly discipline them. And the brain will trigger that. So I thank you for writing that in the chat. Okay. Lastly, we have the hierarchy of needs / relatable pain. We are also aware that race and implicit bias may affect our ability to recognize a child in need, or to recognize relatable symptoms of a child who needs support. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. So we have an activity now that you're going to have 10 minutes to do either by yourself, or if you're with others in your classrooms, you can do it together. This is a table of potential behaviors displayed by students. So we have behavior type A and behavior type B. In behavior type A, we have self-harm, anxiety, and eating disorders. Behavior type B, we have refusal to engage, anger, defiance, and mistrust of authority. So you're going to work in your groups and you're going to have a look at this table and answer the following questions. My screen is frozen. Okay. You're going to look at the table and discuss the following questions. So this works better with an open discussion. So if you're with anyone in your classroom or in your office, please just put yourself on mute and have that discussion with the person next to you, or you can write in the chat. So the questions are as follows. Would this behavior signify a child in need or a child in distress? Would you seek to find the student further support? Would you contact the DSL immediately? Would you discipline a student for this behavior? Would you be empathetic? And number 6, would you be scared for your safety? Now think about, when you discuss those questions, I want you to have a look at the following questions. Did any specific genders come to mind? Did any specific races or ethnicities come to mind when you're imagining who would display behavior type A or behavior type B? And would a student's gender or race impact the support you offer the student? Even subconsciously, please try and put yourself into a even subconsciously mindset. Okay, you have the worksheet in the chat now, and I'm going to give everyone 10 minutes. I'm going to put a little timer on screen. And in 10 minutes, we're going to come back and discuss. Okay.
Where is your platform to provide?
Looking for someone to organize and visualize.
It would be amazing if anyone wanted to take themselves off mute and share anything about the activity that we just did, anything about your answers to the questions or how you found it. Or alternatively, you can write in the chat.
Hi Lara, it's Vandana.
Hi.
You okay? Hi. Obviously from a girls' school, being in a girls' school, the gender thing, not so much as a kind of factor, although I can imagine that it could be. And I think being sort of experienced safeguarding leads, I think we would all recognise that both of those behaviours are children in need and in distress. But I guess what it goes to is that where they've got the sort of the self-harm and the anxiety, it's almost more evident that it is definitely an emotional thing. Whereas you might, perhaps if less experienced, you might tend to think that the behaviours are just behaviours and not necessarily there's something underlying that a little bit more. So I think that does come with experience, obviously through training, but I can imagine that for many staff who don't necessarily deal with safeguarding, their immediate response would be that the behaviour is a factor of that personality rather than a need or distress that is being displayed in a different way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's really important. And I guess the more experienced you are with safeguarding, yeah, you would come to recognize all of the behaviors on the table being a sign of a child in distress and a child in need. When we ran this with a different school, one teacher said something quite interesting. They said that the behaviors from type A was something that weren't chosen. They were behaviors that were almost like a medical diagnosis, whereas she felt like the behaviors in type B were chosen. So the child is choosing to behave in the way that are showing up in B, whereas A, it felt like it was more of a medical diagnostic. So it was more of it wasn't a choice of behavior, it was something that was just being displayed, which I found that quite interesting. But that, I think that perspective in itself could cloud your judgment on how to identify a child in need. If you're seeing certain behaviors, oh, they're just choosing to act like that, rather than it's it's a sign of distress. Does anyone else want to come off mute and share anything that they found or they thought about whilst doing the activity? Or I'll give another 10 seconds for anyone to write anything in the chat that they want to share, and then I'll move on.
Hi there. Yeah, sorry. I was having trouble getting out of my mute then. It was a tricky one in a way, because I was kind of conscious of the fact that I was being expected to make an unconscious bias about the types of behaviors that I might see. So I was thinking, well, what would these stereotypically be perceived to be like? So I was kind of like overthinking it a little bit too much. But yeah, I certainly thought that it might be something that a girl that A might have been a girl and B might have been a boy. And I certainly was sort of conscious of that was more, and that's definitely our sort of unconscious bias about eating disorders, absolutely. But yeah, I think you'd identify that both of those children were experiencing trauma, and they both that both needs to be alerted to the DSL, and obviously you'd gauge how serious both of those incidents were. Nothing about what they were saying there didn't suggest that both of them were equally as serious. But obviously you'd make that assessment. I didn't think I'd be scared in either of those situations. Anyway.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, I think it's specifically when it comes to the eating disorder side of things, that's much, I think there's been a lot more talk about how to identify eating disorders in girls, and not enough on boys. So that's definitely something to also be aware of, about how like gender might also play a role, as well as race and ethnicity. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to carry on. And it's absolutely fine. It wasn't a trick question to be like, are you biased or not? It's absolutely fine if you're like, no, I didn't, no specific genders came to mind, no specific ethnicities came to mind. Good. That's absolutely fine. Okay. Okay, and I'm also going to share a case study with you from some students that we've worked with, the same two students as before, that relate to this hierarchy of needs and relatable pain. So this is a quote from a Black male secondary school student. There's a Black boy in my class that always goes to sleep in class, and when the teacher catches him, the teacher will bang on the desk and tell him to pay attention and give him reminders, which in their school it was sort of like you get a reminder once, you get a reminder twice, and then you get a detention. So the teacher would issue reminders or detentions, but when a white female student in the class also did the same thing, the teacher pulled her aside and asked if she was okay and asked if everything was okay. So I guess that's in that example, that is both gender and race at play in that. Okay, amazing. So combating our unconscious bias and our ability to recognize when there might be a safeguarding concern or a safeguarding flag in front of us. So I really like this table, which shows us when we're most likely to make a decision driven by biases or our subconscious brain. So these include when we need to process information quickly, when we are nervous or lacking in confidence, when we are in a hurry, when we're under pressure, when we are distressed, or when we are overworked and tired. And working in a school, you're probably numerous of these things. You're probably always being pulled in a few directions. People will always need you. People will always need you to make, decisions in a hurry and under pressure. So these are just things to be aware of. Okay. So some things that we have read in some research papers around having a set guideline for escalation of discipline, so that it isn't possible to have any gender or racial biases in the escalation of discipline. So one idea is having some set guidelines on the escalation of discipline, and suggest that teachers make notes on what were the triggers for each level of that discipline. If you already have these guidelines within your school, how can they be made more robust to stop some students being disciplined harsher than other students? And this could also be like a reputation thing. In one of the studies we discussed, different students with different reputations would be disciplined at a faster rate than students with other reputations. So number 2, analyze ethnicity and gender trends for students in detention, students getting sent out of class, bearing in mind the effect on students who miss class as a punishment. So seeing if there's any correlation in students that are getting sent out of class more, how that's affecting their academics. Students in different academic sets, are there any trends on how you can identify and how you can start to combat any of these trends? So this is both ethnicity and gender. Are there any teachers in particular that might show a trend of harsher discipline for global majority students or students of a particular gender? How is this data recorded? How is it handled? Is it recorded? Could certain teachers be asked to attend further unconscious bias training? And just as on an individual level, at times when we feel the most tired, the most under pressure, building in time before decision making. When you find yourself emotionally triggered by a student, trying to regulate, we're all human, so we're all going to be, if we see a student maybe mirroring a certain behavior, we might feel emotionally triggered by different students. And one day you might be fine, and if a day you're feeling particularly tired or overwhelmed, you might feel more emotionally triggered by your student's behavior. But just building in time to regulate your own emotions before taking any disciplinary action. Challenging our assumptions, recognizing when we've made assumptions about students or their families, and challenging where those assumptions come from. Okay. So this is a question that we're going to pose to the group. We're going to take 2 minutes. You can chat to the person next to you if there's anyone next to you, and you can write in the chat. Do you think that there are certain reasons that global majority students would not want to communicate an act of racism? What could be the barriers that they face, or the reasons why they might not want to report racism? Take 2 minutes to discuss, and we're going to write some ideas in the chat box. Yeah, we have distrust in the chat box. So this could be distrust to tell anyone, distrust that it might not be dealt with properly. They might not know who to talk to, I guess. They might not know who to report to. They might not trust that it will be dealt with effectively. I'll give 1 more minute if anyone wants to write anything else down. Hurt, yeah. They could be hurt by the situation and not want to not want to tell anyone about it, not want to discuss it. Another staff member, and when we did this training before, said that a student might not be able to recognize an incident if it's come from their friends. So if their friends who they trust and they love have said something or done something or committed a microaggression against them, they might not be able to recognize that as racism. Thank you, Vandana. Students have often said they feel embarrassed or humiliated, language and cultural ignorance, wanting to be the good immigrant and not complain. Yes, this is these are real life pressures that you can face, definitely as like second, third generation immigrant. Myself and my colleague Naz, who's on this call, we were recently talking about the fact that we both studied like medical and biological degrees at university, you know, because we wanted to be the good immigrant. We wanted to be the good child that, you know, does really well at school and doesn't complain, and we want to get the good degrees, even if we're now both working in the charity sector. But some of these things, it does put pressure on your young people, those cultural pressures. Amazing, thank you. Okay, so we've mentioned a lot of these, but fear of speaking out. This can also be fear of further repercussions, but also embarrassment. Less trust of authority figures. So, you know, they might not think, oh, it won't be dealt with properly, so I'm just not going to report it. Fear of being labeled a miscreant. This is a silly word that we've used, but fear of being labeled, oh, you're the person that always accuses everyone of being racist. Thank you, Naomi. Not wanted to come across as a stereotype such as the angry Black woman. That is such a pervasive and really negative stereotype that results in a lot of people not reporting racism because they don't want to be that angry person that accuses people of being racist and ruffles the feathers and, you know, causes a fuss, and previous experience of being let down. So all of these things, like the more that we're aware of the barriers that our young people might face, both from external perception and both of the barriers that they might have internally, to prevent them from seeking help or you know, flagging something or reporting something, the more aware we are of these barriers, the more we can create safe spaces to encourage your young people within your schools to report and be safe. Okay, so having a look into our safeguarding policies, our practices. So how can we strategize what we've learnt into our safeguarding policies and practices? So number one could be just a review of the safeguarding policies and practices so far within your schools. I'm sure you do this on a regular basis anyway. An audit of the policy should be done involving pupils and parents and staff members. When the audit is complete, improvements can be made to outline the school's commitments and processes to protect all of its students. So I think involving the community is always really, really important, because we might have a perception that there is, you know, we don't have a racism problem within our school because, you know, no one reports it and everyone seems happy. However, involving maybe running a global majority focus group with some of your students, some of your parent body as well, that's a way to really understand what's going on, because they will tell you if asked. For example, in a safeguarding policy that challenges racism, we would want to reference to the racism that children and young people can face in school, but also represent the intersectional lenses that can further compound their experiences. So looking at each of us has multiple identities, and the combination of those identities can result in us being more or less marginalized. So being aware of that and being aware of our multiple identities. It's called intersectionality. Recently we did a training where we looked at processes to follow after a racist incident. And a racist incident, defined by the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, is an incident that anyone has perceived as racist. So most of us think that a racist incident is an incident that goes through all these tests, all the checks, and then it's either determined, oh yes, that was racist, or that wasn't racist. So rather than that perspective, moving it towards a perspective that if anyone perceived that incident as racist, then it was racist and it is treated as such. But moving towards, well, was it done with malice? Was it done without malice? Was it accidental? What was actually happening in the scenario? And this is where we can use something called restorative practices. So when there's an incident that a person has perceived as racist, but there wasn't malice, so it was either an accident or the person didn't realize what they were saying, it's not to say, oh, they didn't mean it and let's just move on. We can use something called a restorative practice. So the victim of the scenario gets to have their voice heard, but then the perpetrator isn't demonized because perhaps they didn't understand what they were saying, or they didn't understand the context of what it was. So you're sort of bringing two people together. So restorative practice, rather than generating a win or lose dynamic, it can be used to enable each person to bring a part of the picture and a part of the story, facing up to the harm until an understanding is reached. So there is potential for the identity of the victim to be appreciated, valued, and upheld, but there's also potential for the perpetrator who caused harm to take that personal accountability and for them to just learn from the situation, not to necessarily be vilified. So I'm going to show you a video right now on restorative practice. And every situation is different. So, you know, I can't give you a clean, like, this is where discipline should be used. This is where restorative practice should be used. But as and when things happen, you can decide what's the best path. But if you understand restorative practice, this can just be another tool for your tool belt.
If you're looking for a quick and easy way to get your business online, there's no better place to start than with our managed WordPress plans. In fact,
conflict is a fact of life. Wherever we live and whoever we spend our time with, none of us can avoid it or its.
Sorry.
Conflict is a fact of life. Wherever we live and whoever we spend our time with, none of us can avoid it or its consequences completely. But when we ignore the complex causes of conflict, we fail to prevent it from arising again. The pain and anxiety of it lingers. Many of us have come to fear conflict. The way it makes us feel, the way it erodes our self-esteem, damages our relationships, and impacts the people around us. When conflict arises, we often focus on who is right and who is wrong, who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, who broke the rules, who should apologise and who should be punished. By using restorative approaches, we can guide those involved to a genuine and lasting resolution, while at the same time equipping them with the skills to successfully navigate conflict throughout their lives. It takes patience, skill, and empathy to involve all parties, a commitment to listening hard and seeking common ground. But through restorative approaches, you can discuss and map the key events and emotions that lead to conflict, recognise it and empower everyone involved to find the best path out of it, repairing as much harm as possible on their way. You can provide them with a new perspective from which to understand how their conflict affects other people, directly and indirectly, and to see the harm that unresolved conflict can do to friendships, families, and communities. From there, the focus is on finding real solutions, not taken from a rule book, but tailored to individual needs. Schools, care homes, prisons and beyond, there is a growing recognition of the power in using restorative approaches to conflict, because it's clear that the lessons of a single conflict, creatively and successfully resolved, can change lives and last a lifetime.
So that video just sort of showed us about, I guess, the power of restorative practice, but restorative practice can take the form of anything, really. It's just sort of dealing with a situation with the intent to sort of bring people together to foster that sort of shared understanding, rather than one person being the victim and then the perpetrator being punished. It's sort of dealing with the incident as it's happening and figuring out the best way that everyone can benefit. Yes, JD, raise your hand. Please come off mute and talk to us.
Hi. I want to ask a question about like restorative incidents. Because thinking if racist incidents are only given restorative moments, where's the deterrence? Because if I just make the flame become an ember, then the person still walks away with racist tendencies. They haven't actually, even if they've learned from me, they still have it innately within them. So like, it hasn't become a deterrence. There's no deterrence. I'm not saying there's a punishment, but if I'm literally just allowing them to have a voice, as it said, that's exactly like the situation that happened with like the Yorkshire Cricket Council. Like everybody was given a voice and there was no outcome.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And thank you for sharing that. And that's a really important, it's a really important point about sort of how and when to use restorative practice. And when it's really important. So if someone is a repeat offender, as in a student at the school, this is not their first time in a racist incident, and you know, you've seen this sort of behavioral tendency from them before, it's probably not best to use restorative practice. It's best to use discipline, disciplinary action, escalating it. Whereas where you would use restorative practice, if it's someone's first time being involved in something like this, and they are from their heart saying it was an accident, I didn't understand what I was saying, it's rather than vilifying that person on I guess their first interaction, is almost rather than vilifying them, and then they might experience shame and guilt, and then that might divide people even further. It's sort of where possible we want to be bringing people back, and these are young people in their formative years. So what we want to be doing is teaching them why they shouldn't have racist tendencies, why they should treat everyone as equal, and that's not because we've told them to, or it's not because they'll be suspended. We want to give them the tools that they make smart choices for themselves, rather than just leading with fear of suspension, or fear of being told off, or fear of getting their parents called in. I would say definitely use those tactics if necessary, but on the first stage, we want to be educating everyone. We want to be giving them the tools for them to make smart choices for themselves, not just because it's what we've said to do. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Does anyone else want to say anything about incidences or restorative practice or anything like that, or anything that they've used in their school that's worked really well? Okay. Okay, so another moving on about how to embed anti-racism into your safeguarding practices, staff training on anti-racism and cultural competency. So it's highly important for teachers to feel confident in recognizing and responding to covert and overt acts of racism. This requires all staff to have knowledge about what covert and overt acts of racism might look like. So knowledge about different cultures and different ethnicities, identifying and acknowledging and combating unconscious biases, and ways to address the topic of racism in the classroom. So this is not always such a straightforward thing about if something happens in your classroom, if a racist incident is happening, how exactly to deal with it. And sometimes it is that practice and sharing best practice with the rest of the staff. If one person has particularly a lot of experience with how to conduct conversations when there's been a racist incident, allow them to share their knowledge with the rest of the school, because it's something that requires that practice and that knowledge. Exploring stereotypes and biases that can affect teaching and learning practices. Okay. And some everyday practices that schools can adopt is empowering student voice. Students often, if asked, will tell you exactly what's going on, exactly what injustices there are within the school, if there's certain people that are particularly prone to being discriminatory. So it's empowering your students to be able to share that with the staff. So empowering student voice, encouraging open discussions on racism and discrimination within the wider context, but having those discussions within the school, and providing opportunities for students to share their experience and ideas on addressing racism effectively. Having cultural awareness events, not just shoehorning everything into like Black History Month or South Asian Heritage Month, which is in July. Having that, normalizing different cultures, which I'm sure a lot of you are doing amazingly. And parent-teacher evenings for feedback, conducting feedback sessions with parents to understand their views on the current practices in curbing racist incidences and how these can be improved, or if they're just very, very happy with what's happening so far. Using inclusive language, avoiding, so I mentioned at the very start of this session about the students' experience, how they experienced their Black History Month as being very stereotypical that one year, and it just really really hurt them. And so trying to avoid any stereotypes and any situations. So one thing that I always try and get us to think about is, am I disrupting or am I observing? So everywhere you go, you can choose to disrupt any injustices that you're seeing, or whether you're observing them. So whenever we observe injustices or stereotypes or anything within our curriculum, ask ourselves, are we disrupting this, or are we observing it? And to disrupt could just be to address it. Be like, oh, we're reading this text. What voices are listened to in this, and what voices are left out? Okay, so we're going to do one more Slido, and then we're pretty near the end, actually. So have you learned anything new so far? If so, what? There'll be the link in the chat right now, and you can also scan the QR code and write anything down. just give everyone 1 more minute to write anything. Amazing. Yeah. So how systemic racism is so very subtle now compared to the 90s. Yeah, absolutely. Things change so much from generation to generation. And I think there were so many discussions around the time when George Floyd was murdered around, is it a US problem? Is it a UK problem? Do we still have systemic racism in this country? And yes is the answer. It's just morphed and it's quite subtle now. Exploring how bias can show up in different forms. Yes, absolutely. Just having a look through different things. And then, yes, the different types of bias that are what I need to be cautious of in myself, being more aware with Black students that they might not feel confident in speaking up about racism they are experiencing. Yes. So even though we use the term global majority to talk about any students that aren't white, there are particular things that affect certain communities more than others. So there are certain behavioral stereotypes that affect Black students much more and Black male students much more than, let's say, other global majority ethnicities. Yeah, need to look at trends within school at a much more forensic level. Yeah, and data is amazing. Just having data can feed so much into everyone's understanding of the school landscape, the school, like the demographics of the school, who's performing best in the school, and how different communities interact with the school curriculum. Perhaps there are trends in different communities picking different A levels or going to certain universities or going to certain feeder schools from primary school. Data and trends can be extremely helpful in understanding your school. Okay, thank you, everyone. Oh. Okay, so there's this ideas activity, but I'm going to let everyone do it in their own time. So in your worksheet, you have at the bottom, you have an activity, and it's basically having a think about anything new that you've learned today, and making notes in the different areas about what new things you would like to implement within your school to improve the ability to safeguard all children. So anything, and it can also be things that your school's doing really, really well at. So classroom practices, you could be like, yeah, we're nailing that. We're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. And you could say, well, actually, however, within our school culture, we could improve on how we celebrate this or how we talk about this. So these are the key areas that we find most important. So leadership, school leadership, classroom practices, school culture, and policies. And policies will also come into practice as well. So best practice. You can just have a think. You can take this to your SLT, or you can discuss it in your next staff meeting about different ideas you want to implement. And then for the last 5 minutes, if anyone wishes to, we always appreciate feedback. So Naz is going to put the link to the survey in the chat, but you can also scan this QR code. It's about 4 questions, so it's not a really long survey, but we would appreciate gathering all the data we can, all the feedback that we can, to make sure that we are always improving. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions before we end the session?